The title of our program here is Pure Awakening. So, Pure Awakening, this is what Wayne Yokoyama said. It connects the past, present, and future. The past is the father's internment camp. The future is the son's universe. The present is Namu Amida Butsu. Based in the past, we stand in the present and seek our way into the future. So, I thought that was really nice, and this is what this exhibit is all about. And I'm really excited to introduce to you, or as most of you all know, Ken. And I forgot to mention that his brother Steve is here, and Jane is here as well, and she's downstairs. Ken gave me his biography, so I'm going to read it to you, and then after that, I'll have Ken say a few words. Ken Horii's artwork has been exhibited nationally in New York, Chicago, Boston, and across New England, and internationally in special exhibits in South Korea and forthcoming in China. His work is in corporate, museum, and private collections in New York and Chicago. He is also a professor of spatial dynamics at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, Rhode Island, has lectured and held workshops at the Samsung Art and Design Institute in Seoul, South Korea, and holds ongoing positions as visiting professor and lecturer at the China Academy of Arts in Hangzhou, China, the Shanghai University Academy of Fine Arts, and the Shanghai Institute of Visual Arts. His work today is about the gentle provocations of his father, Howard Horii, and how that influenced his life as an artist. So I'm very excited to have Ken here. So thank you very much, Ken.
Thank you, Hoshina. Thank you, Hoshina. So many thanks, Hoshina, and Hoshina and the American Buddhist Studies Center. Also Paula, thank you, Yukiko, Kartike, the intern who was working for the media. I should say that we're also recording live here today. So Harriet, my brother Steve, and of course the Clancys, everyone helping out. I really appreciate it. And all the ABSC volunteers for making the exhibition possible. Of course, I want to thank my father, Howard Horii, for all his life's generousness with family, friends, students, and as an artist, architect, and teacher. This is a very special moment for me to exhibit with him, and I dedicate the exhibit to his memory. I must also say, although her work is not included in this exhibit, I want to acknowledge and thank my mother, Shizuko Horii, who at 96 still reflects on her life as a prolific artist and illustrator, and was equally supportive and influential in my life in the arts. Perhaps there will be a future exhibit with my mother's work as well. I want to begin my talk by expressing special thanks to you, Hoshina, for the title of this exhibit, Pure Awakening, which resonated with me immediately when you suggested it. Pure Awakening has prompted examination by me on many levels. And regarding this exhibition, two confluent connections between my father and I. My father's offerings to me and where Pure Awakening is embedded in our respective artwork. I always like to begin with defining terms, and I've examined definitions from the Oxford English Dictionary to confirm how Pure Awakening applies to this exhibit beyond my initial intuitive acceptance. In the OED, pure is free of any contamination, and awakening is to stop sleeping, to become aware. I'll note that while pure is an abstract ideal, within measurable conditions, purity is a relative state. Chemistry admits to only conditions of predominantly pure, not fully free of contamination. I submit that being awake is also a relative term. For example, the well-documented medical states between sleep and waking experience as relative states within a spectrum of wakefulness. While I always accept absolute purity and wakefulness as essential aspirations, it's important to recognize that I've come to feel my father and I have been mostly pure and mostly awake as artists. But also, very importantly, that it is the impurity and lack of consciousness that's propelled us to our mostly pure and mostly awake moments. These moments of pure and impure awakenings had lifelong consequences for me, and I think for my father as well. Our artwork reflects these moments in silent and ever-present ways. With this prelude, I'll share some key moments and observations with you today in the context of my father's and my work. So my father's offerings. Most of you do not know that my exhibiting here at the American Buddhist Studies Center is coming full circle from my earliest childhood dedication to my artistic inclinations. The beginning of the continuum represented by my work in this exhibit. When I was 6 years old, my father and mother, who themselves already had a connection to this Buddhist church, had me start Japanese language classes here every Saturday morning. In the room just below this library, I was one of the youngest and smallest, sitting in a classroom full of young students. I was up front in the front row by the lovely, tall, arched windows. Very soon after beginning my first class, I discovered I could hide a piece of paper behind my lesson book, and by sneaking peeks outside, draw what I found infinitely more interesting at the time than memorizing characters. The Hudson River, the cars on the drive, and the trees in the park below. For 3 years, I did this in class, somehow skirting the fact that I learned next to no Japanese language, save the boyish memorization of forbidden expletives. Then came a threshold point where all students were to stand up and read and recite in Japanese before a gathering of our parents. Of course, I did an unspeakably miserable job. My father rarely expressed his anger toward my brother and I. In fact, his silence at the door at home during one of my transgressions was enough to make me fall in line. This was different. At the end of my humiliating display, he came up to me and he asked in uncharacteristically angry tone, "Have you learned nothing?" I was flustered and scared and humiliated, and all I could muster was something about there being lots of boats on the Hudson River on Saturday morning. At some point later, I'm sure my mom showed him some of my drawings, and I remember him simply saying to me, "Now I understand." Although I truly regret not learning Japanese, I see this episode and my father's response as a kind of awakening. Certainly not pure, but nevertheless powerful. A feeling that my inclinations to see and draw had a value I hadn't been conscious of until I received my father's approval. He gave it validation. To have an awakening, there must be a revealing. What is the key or catalyst that provides a reveal? An action, an energy, a person? Awakening is the result. Revealing is the circumstance that fosters awakening. Two other recollections that reveal my father's and my relationship as artists: verbal lessons speaking to design, and earlier silent urgings revealing art. His verbal design lessons. I had occasions to talk with my dad about architecture, and two names would almost always come up: Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, two historic figures in 20th century architecture. Although I came away from these conversations feeling how compelled Dad was about both of these architects' ambitions for architecture as an agent for large-scale social change, as was especially symptomatic of their modernist era, I always suspected, though he never told me directly, that Dad rejected the idea of grand social engineering through architecture, at least partly because of his experience of relocation during World War II, being witness to living in the conformity of barracks in a condition of forced segregation from the larger society, a comparative characterization in the critique of Wright's and Corbusier's ambitions for social engineering and the mistake of so labeled international style. What Dad clearly admired in his architectural mentors, especially Corbusier, was their manipulation of form and their obsession with the inherent expression of materials. The strength, intrinsic beauty, and creative potential of concrete, stone, alloy metals, and tempered glass. Study of the buildings Dad designed revealed the fruits of this concept, the beauty of expression of form and structure in harmony. Over the years, I've been guided by my dad to have a critically important understanding of design through his perspectives on architectural concepts and practice. But I've also come away with lessons of perseverance, accomplishment despite challenges, and his ethic for intolerance of social injustice. Silent gestures by my dad about art. As a 9-year-old boy, I remember being led by my dad's hand into a white space filled with figures and faces. At first distracted, I recall Dad tapping on my shoulder and gesturing toward one of the figures. In that moment, and then however long we circulated amongst the odd objects, I became filled with uncertainty and awe. What was before me was the retrospective exhibition of the Swiss artist Alberto Giacometti. It was 1965 at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York. This was the first time I recall being captivated in any museum. It was an epiphany for me that art could possess a kind of power and magic I never imagined and had never before been persuaded to recognize. I recall the silence of the moment and continued silent gestures of my dad pointing to this sculpture and that painting. Shepherded by my dad on that day, I came to realize a critical and productive uncertainty within art. I understood art was not just about reflecting reality, but an intensification of reality, a powerful and special case reality. I've always felt that Revelation was as much a gift from my dad as from Giacometti. I've recalled that moment and written about it many times, and in many ways have built my life around it. It was an awakening, where pure awakening is embedded in our artwork. Considering of my work, I've shared 2 awakenings gifted from my father to me, my ongoing conviction that my work hovers in a realm that's beyond the edges of articulation, that the essence of my work is unutterable, is a result of wordless acts of making, as in those secret childhood drawings where I was awakened to myself, began to understand, and felt self-acceptance and nurturance propelled by the validation of my father. And my awakening to the vast expansion of what art is and could be was realized through my father's shaping of my time spent at MoMA in 1965, through his quiet insistence that I pay attention to what was before me. I awoke during that museum day to a consciousness that art is limitless. I transcended my previous unconsciousness about art, years previously passed through museums with apathy. I consider my work to be alongside Buddhism, partly in a dialogue with Buddhist concepts of impermanence, of embracing but also questioning the importance of iconography, and of using spatial diagramming as a mental focus or metaphor. The large 8-foot drawings in this exhibit are from the series Temporal Architecture that incorporates various architectural floor plans, numerous flattened small box patterns, and temporal spatial diagrams like dance notation, all of which is meant to be imagined dynamically, opening and closing in stacks or spatial adjacencies. Although I incorporate some iconographic references to Buddhism and diagrammatic equivalencies to some specific Buddhist iconography, I don't consider myself a Buddhist in a pure sense because I don't practice according to Buddhist processes of prescribed ritual or precepts. When asked repeatedly while traveling in India, "What is your religion?" my answer was always art. That I continue to hold to. So my awakenings in my art are not pure in a Buddhist sense, or as I see it, free from contamination, because they don't strictly follow Buddhist iconographic prescriptions, but also bring in many other references not meant to address Buddhist concepts, some even countering them. I do aspire to full purity, which I consider a new order of hybrid clarity. That quest keeps me making work. I'm awake, but not fully, not yet. Considering my father's work, I consider an essential awakening of my father's to also be a transcendence. Despite the injustice of being uprooted from his family home in California at a critical time of his life, at the edge of adulthood, the artist in him, I am sure, was awakened by a jolt of a strange new landscape, the Arizona desert, a stark contrast of flora, fauna, and climate, of sights and smells and sounds that captivated him, and he captured in selected works in this exhibition. A note that the works selected from that time in the desert were done not there, but after he left and had occasion to recall that awakening of dislocation, to allow those inspirational memories to counter the negative ones. I never heard my father speak with bitterness about the relocation experience. His perceptions as an artist at the time and those same artistic sensibilities allowed him, I believe in later years, to balance the anger of injustice. The one painting of my father's in the exhibition that clearly reflects what sense of anger he did feel is the fiery one depicting the riots at Santa Anita Racetrack, where Japanese Americans who, living in barely clean horse stalls to wait out the building of the final relocation camps, staged a protest that turned to a riot. It was an isolated and now famous bit of civil disobedience born out of frustration and rage. It's the third one over there. While looking at my father's work today, consider the contrast of the riot painting with other paintings showcasing observations of the beauty of the desert. The focus and calm temperament that predominates in his artwork, referring to that time in his life, will leave you with a sense of his transcendence through the awakening of his artistic observation and the pursuit of the beautiful. Pure awakening. Pure awakening for my father and I, in the end, may best be characterized as a dynamic evolution rather than an end to a process, where absolute purity of absolute awakening finally remains an aspiration. Despite the fact that neither my father nor I are practicing Buddhists, perhaps as in Buddhist practice, our quest is seeking an enlightenment. My father, Howard Horii, sent me on this path. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Yeah.
And as I said before, I'm so excited about this exhibit, it's almost I'm speechless to this point. But I do want to say that some of the paintings of Ken's work is available for purchase, and Ken is going to be graciously giving the ADSC a nice donation, which is tax deductible for those who want to purchase any paintings. And I'm honored in a way that Ken is here, and this is our last big event of 2019, and I can't think of what a better way to end the year with than to have this wonderful exhibit. So thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Hoshina. Thank you.
So I wish you all to please enjoy yourselves. In the next room we have refreshments. So take a look around and go into the next room, have some sushi and a glass of wine, and come back out here and pick out a painting and say, I want that one. All right, so thank you.
Thank you all for coming.